President, colleagues, we've already said that during Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, information was discovered regarding the implementation of the Ukrainian authorities with the support and the direct supervision of the US Ministry of Defense of dangerous projects as part of their military and biological program. This activity was carried out on the territory of Ukraine, at the center of Eastern Europe, and in the western borders of Russia, which created a real threat for the biosecurity of our country and the whole region. A week ago, on the request of the Russian Federation, there was the first Security Council meeting held on this topic. Here we asked our Western colleagues a series of questions, but they haven't yet responded to them. The representative of the US wasn't able to explain how the statements of the American officials about how there's allegedly no US-controlled biolaboratories on Ukraine, how that tallies with the fact of the presence of documentary proof of this kind of cooperation between Kiev and Washington. I'd recall here we're talking about an agreement signed in 2005 between the US Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, which clearly sets forth support for the Pentagon to joint biological research applicable to dangerous pathogens located in facilities on Ukrainian territory. Although the American delegation can't and does not want to respond to our questions, but they are, as much as the Russian Defense Ministry is aware, is studying what materials we received from Ukraine biolaboratories about the implementation of military biological programs of the US and their NATO allies on Ukrainian territory. Over the last week, new details have come to light, which allow us to state that the components for biological weapons were being created on the territory of Ukraine. The implementation of the aforementioned American-Ukrainian agreement from 2005, and comments on which we're still waiting for from the US representation, has been going full steam ahead for all these years. However, from the document we can see that the American colleagues were not helping, as they claim, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, but rather the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The Security Council document that we distributed this morning, you see in that material, you can see the so-called technical assistance plan for certain recipients of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. I recommend you to look at this document very carefully. It confirms direct funding and supervision of the Pentagon and its Defense Threat Reduction Agency of military and biological projects in Ukraine. The overall quantity of the funding was $32 million, went directly to the following laboratories from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. In Kiev, the 10th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Health Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Odessa, the 27th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Lvov, the 28th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Kharkov, the 108th Regional Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense Epidemiological Department. I'd like to draw your attention to another vitally important point. The representative of the US State Departments continue to muddle the information and ascertain that US allegedly does not operate in any biological laboratories in the territory of Ukraine, but the facts show otherwise. According to the plan that I mentioned for technical assistance, the donor is the US Ministry of Defense. They established the tasks and the workload as part of the projects on Ukrainian territory, and they set forth a list of the necessary equipment and delegated significant authority to an affiliated contractor company, Black & Veatch, with cooperation with Ukrainian bodies of authority. The recipient of American assistance was the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, and they were allowed timely access for Pentagon and contractor staff to laboratories on Ukrainian territory in order to carry out work as part of these projects, and also to provide access to these facilities alongside Pentagon staff, foreign scientists too. The projects themselves included was implemented not by the Ukrainian scientists, but with their participation. Put simply, the Ukrainian authorities gave the Pentagon carte blanche on the territory of Ukraine to carry out dangerous biological experiments there. The American contractors at the same time got a tax break under Ukrainian legislation. So what did the Ukrainian scientists receive in return, i.e. the Ukrainian people? Free travel to international conferences based on expenses for food and accommodation as established for US civil servants. This kind of compensation is carried out, that's the compensation provided for working alongside dangerous biological science. This is not the noble assistance to Ukraine that the American representatives talk about. This is a cynical use of its territory and population for dangerous research, which Washington does not carry out on its own territory, so it doesn't run a risk of hurting its own people. Won't be surprised if similar facts about activities supervised by the US appear in laboratories in other regions of the world too. We call on countries who provide their territory for carrying out this kind of experiments to the Pentagon to carefully study the contracts for their cooperation with the US in the biological domain. We fully require the question from China to the US to share the data of the activity of the 360 laboratories under American control around the world. Going back to Ukraine, these biolaboratories in Kiev, Odessa, Lvov and Kharkov were selected by the US Risk Reduction Agency not by chance. They were those who implemented the UP8 project focused on studying pathogens of Congo Crimea fever, leptospirosis and hantaviruses. We believe that the interest of the military biologists of the US is specifically in those pathogens is linked to the fact that they are naturally present both in Ukraine and in Russia, and so that their use could then be dressed up as a natural outbreak of these diseases. On the basis in the laboratory in Kharkov, there's also the P781 project to study transmission to humans of diseases through bats. Work on this was done alongside the infamous Lugara Center in Tbilisi. In this context, separate attention should be paid to the Pentagon's choice of carrying out work, the contractors chosen to carry out work in Ukraine, the Black & Veatch company. This is not just any old company. For more than 100 years, it's been working for the American Army. It has built for the Army military bases, including a laboratory in Los Alamos, to develop nuclear weapons. Research into human transmission of diseases through bats in Ukrainian biolaboratories was systemic and has been happening as a minimum since 2009 with the direct oversight of specialists from the USA. During the implementation of these projects, 6 families of viruses were identified, including coronaviruses and 3 types of pathogenic bacteria, the pathogens from the plague, brucellosis and leptospirosis. These are the most attractive option to use for infection because they are resistant to medicine and they spread very quickly from animals to people. As part of the Flu Fly Away project, the Kharkov Institute of Veterinary Medicine studied wild birds as a vector to transmit avian flu. At the same time, they assessed the ways in which the transmission process could become uncontrollable, cause economic damage, and create a risk to food security. Documents show the involvement of the Kharkov Institute in the work to collect strains of avian flu viruses which have high epidemiological potential and could cross the species barrier. The Russian Ministry of Defense also has more and more new documents about the transfer of samples of blood serum of Ukrainian citizens to the territory of 3rd countries, including to the UK, Georgia and Germany. The analysis of the information gives us grounds to say that the Ukrainian specialists were not informed about the potential risks of the transfer of biological materials and are kept in the dark and don't have a real idea about the real objectives of the research being carried out. And this is not surprising if, according to the contract documentation that I mentioned earlier, they are simply playing a secondary role. We also have new data about attempts to destroy biological materials and documentation in Ukrainian laboratories in order to quickly wipe the traces of the implementation of military and biological programs. We know that during the activities to destroy this, the veterinary medicine laboratory in Hlebodarsk town, the citizens of Ukraine, the staff working there, weren't even allowed into the building. This laboratory cooperates with the Melchnikov Scientific Research Institute in Odessa, where research is carried out into pathogens of the plague, anthrax, cholera, and tularemia. In their attempts to wipe the traces of biological waste from the laboratories in Hlebodarsk, these waste was taken 120 kilometers towards the western border, towards Tarutino and Berezino. The Russian Ministry of Defense has recorded all of these information to carry out a legal assessment further down the line. The urgent destruction of documents in Kherson biolaboratory, we believe that the reason for this rush was a wish to hide from Russian specialists information about an outbreak in 2019 in Kherson of dirophilariasis. It's a disease which is spread by mosquitoes. The 4 cases of infection of this disease were identified in February, which is not usual for the life cycle of these insects, even bearing in mind the incubation period for the disease. At the same time, we are aware that in April 2019, a representative of the Pentagon visited the local health institutions where they learned of the results of the epidemiological research, and they were able to copy the medical documentation. I'm ready to snap up any fakes which are provided by the Ukrainian authorities with the support of their Western backers. The Western media expressing doubts as regards the reliability of the material that the Russian Ministry of Defense has published. I'd like to draw your attention to the following. The documents that we found have a signature, a real signature of officials from the US. Particularly, many of them are signed by the head of the Ukrainian office of the Threat Reduction Agency, Joanna Wintrol. This is a Pentagon staff member and well-known in non-proliferation circles. Before Ukraine, she supervised the destruction of chemical weapons in Libya. If journalists really are interested in verifying the documents that we provided, then I propose that you ask her directly, is that really her signature? I'd like to underscore once again that here we're talking not simply about the US and Ukraine's violation of the Biological Weapons Convention. We're actually talking about that there is more and more proof that at the center of Eastern Europe, until the very last minute, there was a dangerous military biological activity being carried out, the consequences of which at any time could spread beyond the country and even into the region. The scale of casualties, including amongst the population of European countries in this case, in this scenario, is hard to imagine. Coronavirus could be nothing compared with this. And we're also concerned by that there's a threat that already exists. For example, in 2018, those living in Lugansk and Donetsk, there was a sharp spike in cases of tuberculosis caused by a new multi-resistant strain. During this mass outbreak recorded in the region, near Pesk, more than 70 cases of infection were recorded, which quickly became lethal. This doesn't look like coincidence. In conclusion, I'd like to comment on the statement made by the representative of the UN Secretariat, that the Secretariat does not have information about the implementation of military and biological programs on the territory of Ukraine. In line with this BWC, states parties provide the UN information about facilities and biological activities carried out. We're talking about confidence-building measures which are published in order to monitor implementation of the Convention. Since 2006, which was when these projects started, including the projects UP4, UP8 and P781, The US and Ukraine has been deliberately keeping quiet about this in their reports, despite the clear military and biological purposes of this. This is why Russia for many years has been calling for a strengthening of the BWC regime and to adopt a legally binding protocol to the convention, which would allow us to create an effective mechanism of verification and include in reporting from states parties information on military biological activities carried out abroad. For 20 years, the US has been blocking this kind of work, refusing to provide this kind of information. Indeed, one other question, which the representatives of the US have time and time again been not providing us with, all of the facts I listed today on the 11th of March are only the tip of the iceberg. Our Ministry of Defense is receiving more and more material, and we're analysing them. We will continue to keep the international community informed about the unlawful activity carried out by the Pentagon on Ukrainian territory. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for joining us today to repeat what you gave us, exactly what you gave us last week. And last week, we heard from the Russian representative a tirade of bizarre conspiracy theories. This week, we're hearing a whole lot more where that came from, things that sound like they were forwarded to him on a chain email from some dark corner of the internet. President Biden has a word for this kind of talk: malarkey. As I said 1 week ago, Ukraine does not have a biological weapons program. There are no Ukrainian biological weapons laboratories, not near Russia's border, not anywhere. There are only public health facilities, proudly, and I say proudly, supported and recognized by the US government, the World Health Organization, and other governments and international institutions. In fact, it is Russia that has long maintained a biological weapons program in violation of international law. It is Russia that has a well-documented history of using chemical weapons. It is Russia who is the aggressor here. It was Russian operatives who poisoned Alexei Navalny and Sergei and Yulia Skripal with nerve agents. It is Russia that continues to support the Assad regime in Syria and shield it from accountability when the UN and the OPCW have confirmed that Assad has recently used chemical weapons over the past several years. Let's not forget why we are really here today. We're here because Russia knew its cynical ploy to pass an exculpatory resolution had failed. This meeting is the result of their isolation on this council and on the world stage. We're not buying what they're selling, literally or figuratively. And I will reiterate the United States' deep and serious concern that Russia's calling for this meeting is a potential false flag effort in action. Russia has repeatedly accused other countries of the very violations it plans to perpetrate. We continue to believe it is possible that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people. We aren't going to dignify Russia's disinformation or conspiracy theories, but we will continue to sound the alarm and tell the world where we think Russia is heading. And we will remind the world that Russia has repeatedly lied to this council over recent weeks. Despite all the evidence we could see with our own eyes, it told us that it was not going to invade Ukraine, that it was engaged in war games, that it was interested in diplomacy. I asked the Russian PR, where are the 100,000 troops who were sitting on the Russian side of the border now? Sadly, I think many of them have given their lives in this senseless, unconscionable war against the Ukrainian people. Russia lied to its own people as well, shutting down media to try and hide the truth. And I will not repeat the slurs and false accusations that Russia has hurled against the Ukrainian people and the United States repeatedly at this table. But we know that Russia's disinformation is a sign of its desperation. That's the truth, and we will continue to ensure the world sees it and hears it. Thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of the Russian Federation asks for the floor to make an additional statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Propaganda, disinformation, amateurism, unbased imagination, false flag operations. That's what we've heard today. Some statements have practically, literally repeated their statements from the 11th of March. If you haven't heard anything new in our statement today, it's because you weren't listening to us. We provided not fiction, not something found in the dark web, but we provided new material and documents which we disseminated. These documents have signatures. These documents were prepared on the basis of cooperation between the Ukraine and the US in the biological field. And if you can verify what we provide, then I'd ask you to look. But I think that anyone who needs to be able to find this. If you want to do so, then do so. But don't make unfounded accusations of Russian propaganda, but reply to the questions that we asked. You're refusing to do so, simply because you've got nothing to say. Rather than this, you're trying to accuse us of intention to deploy biological and chemical weapons against Ukraine. This is real cynicism, isn't it? We've already warned about the fact that we know, and we officially warned that we do know, and we do have information about Ukrainian nationalists using chemical agents in some regions to carry out a provocation and then accuse Russia of having done it. This is a false flag operation. I say that we didn't listen to us properly, particularly the US. We didn't say, as the representative of the US claimed, that Ukraine itself has a military biological program. This program, we said, based on the documents that we have, is something that the US itself has, not Ukraine. And Ukraine, in this case, is being kept in the dark. And we already provided you with facts, talked you through them, about the spike in Ukraine of dangerous lethal diseases, which there's no explanation for them through with no usual factors. They can't explain that. It could be linked to this kind of activity, though. Today, again, we heard the argument that the biggest argument of proof that in Ukraine there are no biological activities being taken place is the view, and the main, this was the UN Secretariat view, but already said that the UN can't know about this. Secret military biological programs and those who carry them out are not shared with the UN or with anybody else. And as I already said, and I said before, we put this item on the agenda. New facts have appeared, and we will keep the Security Council abreast, as well as the international community, about these facts, which will be, I'm sure, revealed in the near future. Thank you very much.